The day the Red Oak Homeowners Association sent a crew to bulldoze my retaining dam was the day the birds stopped singing in my backyard. And honestly, that silence should have been the first omen that things were about to go south in a very permanent way. I stood there on my porch, knuckles white as I gripped a lukewarm mug of coffee, watching 3 yellow excavators crawl over the ridge like mechanical beetles intent on eating my life's work, while Francine Miller stood at the edge of the site in a wide-brimmed sun hat, looking for all the world like she'd just personally liberated the neighborhood from a war zone. She had this permanent expression on her face, like she was constantly smelling something sour, and she ran our HOA with the kind of iron-fisted obsession you'd expect from a bored dictator with too much time and a Pinterest board full of, neighborhood aesthetic, goals. See, I'm a structural engineer by trade, a guy who spends his days looking at load-bearing capacities and soil saturation levels. So when I moved into this valley lot 5 years ago, I knew the drainage was a nightmare waiting to happen. The runoff from the higher estates, those million-dollar colonials with their perfectly manicured, non-absorbent lawns, all funneled right toward my property before hitting the creek. So I spent a small fortune and a year of weekends building a tiered, reinforced stone dam that doubled as a beautiful garden feature, complete with native grasses and a spillway that actually worked. But to Francine, it wasn't an a feat of engineering. It was, an industrial eyesore, that didn't fit the, French provincial vibe, She decided we were all supposed to be living in this year. And no matter how many city-approved permits I showed her, or how many times I explained that the water had to go somewhere, she just wooed into listen. She'd look at my technical drawings with this blank, condescending stare and say things like, well, the bylaws say no unauthorized masonry, Silas, and we really feel that a nice, flat lawn would increase everyone's curb appeal, which is HOA speak for, I don't care if your basement floods as long as the view from my window is pretty, I tried to be the bigger person, I really did. I went to the meetings, I brought in independent inspectors who told her the dam was the only thing keeping the lower half of the street from becoming a swamp. But Francine had her little circle of sycophants on the board who'd nod along to whatever she said because they were all terrified of her. So there I was, watching $40,000 worth of stone and engineering being reduced to a pile of rubble in the name of, neighborhood harmony, And as the last of the stones was hauled away, Francine actually had the nerve to walk up to my driveway, smoothing out her linen skirt, and tell me I should be thanking her for helping me get into, compliance, I just looked at her, my voice real quiet, and I told her, Francine, you didn't just remove a wall, you removed a plug, and nature doesn't give a damn about your bylaws, But she just gave me that fake, pitying smile and told me to, stop being so dramatic, before she sauntered off to her own house at the bottom of the slope. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat on my back deck with a flashlight, listening to the sound of the earth shifting, that low, wet squelch that tells you the soil is becoming a sponge. And by 4 a.m., I could already see the first signs of the disaster I'd spent years preventing. It started with a soft shimmer on the grass. Then the low-lying flower beds near the property line began to sink, and by sunrise, the redirection of the water table was in full swing, except it wasn't pooling on my lot anymore, because the excavators had changed the grade of the land. Now, all that pressure, all that pin-up runoff from the spring rains, was following the path of least resistance right into the foundations of the houses that had voted to tear the dam down, and the irony of it was so thick you could taste it. Francine's house was the crown jewel of the street. This massive white estate with a wraparound porch and a basement she'd just finished converting into a high-end wine cellar. And as the sun came up, I watched a literal river of muddy water begin to carve a path through her prize-winning rose bushes. I walked down to the edge of my lawn, leaning against my fence with a fresh coffee, and I saw her come running out in her silk pajamas, screaming at the top of her lungs as her brand-new cobblestone driveway began to buckle and heave like it was made of cardboard. The ground beneath us was heavy clay, the kind that holds onto water until it just gives up and turns into a liquid, and without my dam to regulate the flow, the entire slope was basically melting and honestly Seeing her decorative garden gnomes disappear into a sinkhole was one of the most satisfying things I've ever witnessed. She saw me standing there, and she came sloshing over, mud up to her ankles, looking like a drowned rat, and she demanded that I, do something, to stop the water, as if I could just wave a magic wand and undo the destruction she'd paid 20 grand to cause. I just tilted my mug toward her and said, sorry, Francine, I'd love to help, but according to the last HOA meeting, I'm not allowed to perform any unauthorized landscaping on this property, so I guess we'll just have to let the French provincial vibe handle it, She turned purple, her jaw working, but no words coming out. And as the sound of a foundation cracking echoed across the yard, a sound like a gunshot, I knew this was just the beginning of a very, very long week for Red Oak Estates. By noon, the neighborhood looked like a war zone, with 3 different basements completely flooded and the city's code enforcement trucks pulling up because someone had called in an anonymous tip about illegal land disruption on a protected watershed. Francine tried to play it off at first. She sent out an emergency email to the whole neighborhood claiming it was just a, seasonal fluke, and that the HOA was, handling the situation, but you can handle, the fact that your house is slowly sliding 6 inches to the left. The neighbors who had once been her biggest supporters were now standing on their porches in rubber boots, looking at their ruined crawl spaces and their floating patio furniture, and the whispers started turning into real, angry shouting. I stayed out of the fray, mostly because I was too busy dealing with the lawyers I'd hired the moment the first bulldozer hit my property, and when I finally walked into the emergency town hall meeting 3 days later, the atmosphere was less like a neighborhood gathering and more like a lynch mob. Francine was sitting at the front table, her hands shaking as she clutched a clipboard, trying to explain that the insurance companies were denying claims because the damage was caused by, unauthorized alterations to the drainage system, authorized by the board itself. That's when I stood up in the back of the room, tossed a 50-page folder onto the table, and let the real bomb drop because while Francine was busy worrying about the, look, of the neighborhood, she'd forgotten one very important detail: the city's public works department. I told the room, very calmly, that not only was the dam I'd built fully permitted by the city, but the HOA's, vandalism, of it had violated 3 different Environmental Protection Acts because that runoff fed directly into a protected wetland area down the creek. I'd spent my lunch breaks for the last week talking to the district attorney's office and the county's forensic accountants, and what we found was even more rotten than the mud in Francine's wine cellar. See, when you're an engineer, you learn how to follow paths of water, paths of stress, and paths of money. And it turns out the, contractor, Francine hired to tear down my dam wasn't a licensed demolition crew at all. It was a shell company registered to her own brother-in-law, and the HOA had paid them nearly double the market rate for a, landscaping restoration, that was actually just a illegal demolition. The room went dead silent as I projected the bank transfers and the forged city work orders onto the screen, showing everyone that their monthly dues had been going toward the, community garden, or pool maintenance, but had been laundered through a series of fake invoices to pay for Francine's new kitchen remodel and her brother-in-law's gambling debts. The look on her face was something I'll carry to my grave. That sudden, crushing realization that she was an just losing her social standing. She was looking at a felony indictment. And when the county sheriff's deputies walked into the back of the clubhouse, she didn't even try to run. The board was dissolved on the spot by a unanimous vote of the residents, most of whom were crying or shouting or trying to figure out how they were going to pay for the mold remediation in their homes. And as Francine was led out in handcuffs, she had the audacity to look at me and hiss that I'd, ruined everything, I just watched her go, thinking about the frogs that had finally started chirping again in the standing water behind her house. And I realized that sometimes the only way to clean a swamp is to let it overflow first. In the months that followed, the neighborhood changed in a way I didn't expect. We didn't just rebuild the dam, this time with the full desperate funding of the city and the remaining HOA assets, but we built it as a community project with a park and a walking trail that everyone could use. Francine's house sat empty for a long time, a rotting monument to her own arrogance, until the bank finally sold it for pennies on the dollar to a young family who didn't end oppos. Care about, in quote, French provincial vibes, in quote, as much as they cared about having a dry basement. The new board is run by a retired schoolteacher who thinks, in quote, compliance, in quote, means making sure the elderly neighbors get their driveways shoveled in the winter, and we haven and oppos. T had a single argument about fence colors in 3 years. But even now, whenever it rains real hard, I still go out to the porch and look at that stone wall, reminded that power, much like water, always finds a way to reveal the cracks in the foundation. And if you try to hold it back with nothing but ego and a clipboard, you're eventually going to find yourself underwater. It makes me wonder, though, how many other neighborhoods out there are one, in quote, aesthetic choice, in quote, away from a total collapse. And honestly, if your HOA told you to tear down something that was keeping your house safe just to make it look, in quote, prettier, in quote, would you have the guts to stand your ground, or would you wait until you were treading water to realize who was actually in charge? Let me know in the comments if you've ever had a run-in with a power-tripping board that went horribly wrong, because I have a feeling my story is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the chaos hidden behind those white picket fences.